See, all right, everyone. So, on today's episode, we're going to be looking at the life and times of Chiang Kai Shek. Let's see. Now, if you're anything like me, well, you wouldn't be like me, but that sounds way too conceited. But if you're anything like me, you know who the guy is. However, if you're just sort of the average layperson who reads the occasional current events thing, and whenever they say something about China and Taiwan, you can always see this little snippet of a history lesson attached on at the last minute. It'll say Taiwan and China split at the end of a civil war, which resulted in the nationalists fleeing to Taiwan and the communists controlling the mainland. And that's about as much as we get sometimes. So, we all know who Mao is, but do we know who Chiang Kai Shek is? Well, that's what we're here to teach you today. Alrighty, so Chiang Kai Shek. Chiang Kai Shek, October 31st, 1887 to April 5th, 1975. Oh wow, he was born on Halloween. Trick or treat. Also known as Chang Chung Cheng and romanized via Mandarin as Chang Chieshi and Zhang Jieshi, was a Chinese nationalist politician, revolutionary, and military leader who served as the leader of the Republic of China between 1928 and 1975, first in mainland China until 1949, and then in Taiwan until his death. Born in Zhejiang, Zhejiang province, Chiang was a member of the Kuomintang KMT and a lieutenant of Sun Yatsin in the revolution to overthrow the Beiyang government and reunify China. With help from the Soviets and the Communist Party of China, CPC, commonly known as the Chinese Communist Party or CCP, Chiang organized the military for Sun's Canton nationalist government and headed the Whampoa Military Academy. Commander-in-Chief of the National Revolutionary Army, from which he came to be known as Generalissimo, he led the Northern Expedition from 1926 to 1928, before defeating a coalition of warlords and nominally reunifying China under a new nationalist government. Midway through the campaign, the KMT-CPC alliance broke down and Chiang purged the communists inside the party, triggering a civil war with the CPC, which he eventually lost in 1949. It's funny, there are more than a couple times where I almost said, was it PCP? I'm like, no wait, that's something else entirely. As leader of the Republic of China in the Nanjing Decade, Chiang sought to strike a difficult balance between modernizing China while also devoting resources to defending the nation against the impending Japanese threat. Trying to avoid a war with Japan while hostilities with CPC continued, he was kidnapped in the Xi'an incident and obliged to form an anti-Japanese united front with the CPC. Following the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, he mobilized China for the Second Sino-Japanese War. For 8 years, he led the War of Resistance against a vastly superior enemy, mostly from the wartime capital of Chongqing. As the leader of a major Allied power, Chiang met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the Cairo Conference to discuss terms for Japanese surrender. No sooner had the Second World War ended than the Civil War with the Communists, by then led by Mao Zedong, resumed. It's funny, there's been two different ways that you can read Mao's last name. I've seen it go from Mao Zedong to Mao Zedong. There's so many ways you can make fun of that, but I think that's probably I think it's his last name, which is why most people just refer to him as Mao. Plus, do we really want to put in the effort? Chiang's nationalists were mostly defeated in a few decisive battles in 1948. In 1949, Chiang's government and army retreated to Taiwan, where Chiang imposed martial law and persecuted critics during the White Terror. Presiding over a period of social reforms and economic prosperity, Chiang won 5 elections to 6-year terms as President of the Republic of China and was Director General of the Kuomintang until his death in 1975. 3 years into his 5th term as president and just 1 year before Mao's death. One of the longest-serving non-royal heads of state in the 20th century, Chiang was the longest-serving non-royal ruler of China, having held the post for 46 years. Like Mao, he is regarded as a controversial figure. Supporters credit him with playing a major part in unifying the nation and leading the Chinese resistance against Japan, as well as with countering Soviet communist encroachment. Detractors and critics denounce him as a dictator at the front of an authoritarian regime who suppressed opponents. So, it's kind of funny. I've read historical things about Chiang Kai Shek and Mao and how China ended up. One of the first books of nonfiction that I ever bought was the biography of Chiang Kai Shek by an author named Jonathan Finby. I don't know if it's still in print, but anyway, yeah. He said that ultimately it seems as though Chiang won, because if you looked at China today, it looks way closer to something that Chiang had envisioned rather than Mao's communist ideals. Let's see, going down, that is a long table of contents. Like many other Chinese historical figures, Chiang used several names throughout his life. The name inscribed in the genealogical records of his family is Chiang Chao Tai. Let's see. There's a lot of detail that, in the interest of brevity, I'm just going to have to skip over. Sorry for the inconvenience. Let's see. This so-called register name is one under which he has, is the one under which his extended relatives knew him, and the one he used in formal occasions, such as when he got married. In deference to tradition, family members did not use the register name in conversation with people outside of the family. The concept of a real or original name was not as clear-cut in China as it is in the Western world. In honor of tradition, Chinese families waited a number of years before officially naming their children. In the meantime, they used a milk name given to the infant shortly after his birth and known only to the close family. Thus, the actual name that Chiang received at birth was Chiang Yuan. Let's see. In 1903, the 16-year-old Chiang went to Ningbo to be a student, and he chose a school name. This was actually the formal name of a person used by older people to address him, and the one he would use the most in the first decades of his life. As the person grew older, younger generations would have to use one of the courtesy names instead. Colloquially, the school name is called big name, whereas the milk name is known as the small name. The school name that Chiang chose for himself was Ji Qing. Let's see. I'm guessing, this just goes to show my ignorance. I'm guessing there have been different systems of transliteration of Chinese into Western, into the English alphabet. I'm guessing what this Wade Giles thing is. Let's see. So let's see. The school name that Chiang chose for himself was Ji Qing, and let's see. It says here it means purity of aspirations. For the next 15 years or so, Chiang was known as Zhang Ji King. This is the name under which Sun Yatsin known him when Chiang joined the Republicans in Guangdong in the 1910s. In 1912, In 1912, when Wang Jing Wei was in Japan, he started to use the name Chiang Kai Shek as a pen name for the articles that he published in a Chinese magazine he founded, Voice of the Army. Jieshi is the pinyin romanization of his name, based on Mandarin, but the most recognized romanized rendering as Kai Shek, which is in Cantonese romanization. As the Republicans were based in Canton, a Cantonese-speaking area known as Guangdong, Chang became known by Westerners under the Cantonese romanization of his courtesy name, while the family name, as known in English, seeks to be the Mandarin pronunciation of his Chinese family name, transliterated in Wade Giles. Kai Shek Jieshi soon became Chang's courtesy name. Some think the name was chosen from the classic Chinese book, the I Ching. He who is firm as a rock is the beginning of line 2 of hexagram 16. Others note that the first character of his courtesy name is also the first character of the courtesy name of his brother and other male relatives on the same generation line, while the second character of his courtesy name, Shi, suggests that the second character of his register name, Tai, the famous Mount Tai. Courtesy names in China often bore a connection with the personal name of the person, as the courtesy name is the name used by people of the same generation to address the person. Chang soon became known under his new name. This sounds like a really complicated system. I mean, it's funny, I know people have like names that they call each other at work, in their family, what's on your government identification papers, but this, it's like, wow. Okay, where was I? His name is also written in Taiwan as the late President Honorable Chang, where the one character wide space in front of his name, known as Nuo Tai, shows respect. He is often called Honorable Chang without the title or space, or his name Chang Chung Cheng in Taiwan. In this context, his name Chiang Kai Shek in this article is spelled using the Wade Giles system of transliteration for standard Chinese as opposed to the Hanyu pinyin, which is spelled as Zhang Jieshi, though the later was adopted by the Republic of China government in 2009 as its official romanization. Okay, so I was right about earlier. Man, this probably should have looked that up before I started making this video, but we're already into it. Let's see. Chang was born on October 31st, 1887 in Jikou, a town in Fenghua, Zhejiang, China, about 30 kilometers, 19 miles west of central Ningbo. He was born into a family of Wu Chinese-speaking people with their ancestral home, a concept important in Chinese society, in Hei Chao, a town in Yijing, Jiangsu, about 38 kilometers, 24 miles southwest of central Wuxi and 10 kilometers from the shores of Lake Tai. He was the third child and second son of his father, Chang Chao-tsung, also Chang Xuan, and the first child of his father's third wife, Wang Sai-yu, who were members of a prosperous family of salt merchants. Chang lost his father when he was 8, and he wrote of his mother as the embodiment of Confucian virtues. The young Chang was inspired throughout his youth by the realization that the reputation of an honored family rested upon his shoulders. He was a naughty child. At a young age, he was interested in war. As he grew older, Chang became more aware of the issues that surrounded him, and in his speech to the Kuomintang in 1945 said, "As you all know, I was an orphan boy in a poor family, deprived of any protection after the death of her husband. My mother was exposed to the most ruthless exploitation by neighboring ruffians and the local gentry. The effort she made in fighting against the intrigues of these family intruders certainly endowed her child, brought up in such an environment, with an indomitable spirit to fight for justice. I felt throughout my childhood that mother and I were fighting a helpless lone war. We were alone in a desert. No available or possible assistance could we look forward to. But our determination was never shaken nor hope abandoned. In early 1906, Chang caught off his queue the required hairstyle of men during the Qing dynasty and had it sent home from school, shocking the people in his hometown. So I don't know if this Wikipedia article goes into it too much. But one of the things they really touch upon in Jonathan Finby's book is the relationship that Chang had with his mom. So apparently, basically, he thought of her as like a superhero. And throughout his career and his life, one of the things he would use to try to show some level of humility was his adoration for his mom. And it's something that kind of works for somebody who wielded that much power like him. Because it's like, it can kind of convince you that, okay, maybe he's not so bad a guy. And you could have a whole conversation, probably a whole series of videos about just that subject alone. But for now, we're just going to stick to the exposition in Wikipedia. So, education in Japan. Chang grew up at a time in which military defeats, natural disasters, famines, revolts, unequal treaties, and civil wars had left the Manchu-dominated Qing dynasty destabilized and in debt. Successive demands of the Western powers and Japan since the Opium War had left Chang owing millions of taels of silver. I don't know what that would translate to in like a current denomination. During his first visit to Japan to pursue a military career from April 1906 to later that year, he describes himself having strong nationalistic feelings with the desire, among others, to expel the Manchu king and to restore China. So it kind of sounds like all the way back in 1906, he wanted to make China great again, but couldn't order like hats that would be made for that. Oh, this joke is gonna age horribly. Let's see. In a 1969 speech, Chang related a story about his boat trip to Japan at 19 years old. Another passenger on the ship, a Chinese fellow student who was in the habit of spitting on the floor, was chided by a Chinese sailor who said that Japanese people did not spit on the floor, but instead would spit into a handkerchief. Chang used the story as an example of how the common man in 1969 Taiwan had not developed the spirit of public sanitation that Japan had. Chang decided to pursue a military career. He began his military training at the Baoding Military Academy in 1906. The same year, Japan left its bimetallic currency standard, devaluing its yen. He left for Tokyo Shimbugakko, a preparatory school for the Imperial Japanese Army Academy intended for Chinese students in 1907. There he came under the influence of compatriots to support the revolutionary movement to overthrow the Manchu-dominated Qing dynasty and to set up a Han-dominated Chinese republic. He befriended Qin Qimei, and in 1908, Qin brought Chang into the Tongminghui as an important revolutionary brotherhood of the era. Finishing his military school at Tokyo Shimbugakko, Chang served in the Imperial Japanese Army from 1909 to 1911. So, this video might sound a lot like me I'm going to interject and always say something that the Jonathan Finby book would touch upon. And I guess to his credit as a storyteller, or this will sound terrible, but regurgitating historical facts to elicit the effect of a novel. He touches upon this in Chang's time at the military academy in Japan. So there are two interesting things that happened. So Chang was in a class where the teacher was Japanese, and he really didn't like China. And so he took a lump of clay and said, like, there's so much bacteria on this lump of clay, like there are Chinese people in China. So Chang, he walked up to this and he smashed the clay lump on the floor. Now, he got sent to, I guess, the headmaster's office, but somehow he got out of that situation without any reprimands. Also, one of the things they touch upon in the book is the fact that when Chang did go to the military academy in Japan, people would say that he'll probably never be anything more than just a soldier. And a couple decades later, he was the sort of leading military antagonist that Japan faced in the Second Sino-Japanese War / the Pacific Theater in World War II. So, returning to China. After learning of the Wuchang Uprising, Chiang turned to China in 1911, intending to fight as an artillery officer. He served in the Revolutionary Forces, leading a regiment in Shanghai under his friend and mentor Qin Shi Mei as one of Qin's chief lieutenants. In early 1912, a dispute arose between Qin and Tao Qin-chang, an influential member of the Revolutionary Alliance who opposed both Sun Yatsin and Qin. Tao sought to avoid escalating the quarrel by hiding in a hospital, but Chiang discovered him there. Qin dispatched assassins. Chiang may not have taken part in the act, but would later assume responsibility to help Qin avoid trouble. Qin valued Chiang despite Chiang's already legendary temper, regarding such bellicosity as useful in a military leader. Chiang's friendship with Qin Shi Mei signaled an association with Shanghai's criminal syndicate, the Green Gang, headed by Du Yuesheng and Wang Jing Wei. During Chiang's time in Shanghai, the Shanghai International Settlement Police observed him and eventually charged him with various felonies. These charges never resulted in a trial, and Chiang was never jailed. So I've done a lot of reading about historical figures, guys who wind up taking a near monopoly-like level of control over their country. And it always seems that this seems to be a common factor. They all get in trouble with the law of the government they wind up overthrowing. Like, you look at anybody and it's like, oh, they were in jail, or oh, they got charged with this. It seems like almost a recipe for, them somehow ascending to power. So Chiang became a founding member of the KMT after the success of the February 1912 of the 1911 revolution. After the takeover of the Republican government by yuanjikai and the failed Second Revolution in 1913, Chiang, like his KMT comrades, divided his time between exile in Japan and the havens of the Shanghai International Settlement. In Shanghai, Chiang cultivated ties with the city's underworld gangs, which were dominated by the notorious Green Gang and its leader, Du Yuesheng. On 18th of May 1916, agents of yuanjikai assassinated Qin Shi Mei. Chiang then succeeded Qin as leader of the Chinese Revolutionary Party in Shanghai. Sun Yat-sen's political career reached its lowest point during this time when most of his old Revolutionary Alliance comrades refused to join him in the exiled Chinese Revolutionary Party. So, not knowing how much in depth this goes, the Wikipedia article. So, who is yuanjikai? A slight derailment from our main topic, Chiang Kai Shek. So, Yuan Shikai was this general in the Qing dynasty who he got powerful. In fact, a little too powerful for the dynasty's liking. Now, one of the things that made him a threat was the fact that he was knowledgeable in the ways of modern military at the time. And of course, they were like, okay, do we want him to really contest our power? But when all the other revolutionaries showed up, they were like, okay, it's either the devil we know or the devil we don't know. And but one of the ways that the revolutionaries avoided a clash with him, with Yuan Shikai, was they're like, hey, we'll make you president for the first 10 years if you just side with us. How's that? So he was like, all right. But what later happened is that he was like, you know what? I like power. I think I'm going to stick around. And he basically wound up declaring himself an emperor. And luckily for the revolution, he died. But, that had its own troubles, which we'll get into later on. Okay, establishing the Kuomintang's position. In 1917, Sun Yatsin moved his base of operations to Canton, now known as Guangzhou, and Chiang joined him in 1918. At this time, Sun remained largely sidelined. Without arms or money, he was soon expelled from Kwantung and exiled to Shanghai. He was restored to Kwantung with mercenary help in 1920. After his return to Kwantung, a rift developed between Sun, who sought to militarily unify China under the KMT, and Guangdong governor Qin Jianming, who wanted to implement a federalist system with Guangdong as a model province. On June 16, 1922, Ye Zhu, a general of Qin's whom Sun had attempted to exile, led an assault on Kwantun's presidential palace. Sun had already fled to the naval yard and boarded the SS Hai Ki, but his wife narrowly evaded shelling and rifle fire as she fled. They met on the SS Yongfeng, where Chiang joined them as swiftly as he could return from Shanghai, where he was ritually mourning his mother's death. For about 50 days, Chiang stayed with Sun, protecting and caring for him and earning his lasting trust. They abandoned their attacks on Qin on August 9th, taking a British ship to Hong Kong and traveling to Shanghai by steamer. So he saved his life. So he saved Sun Yat-sen's life. And, hey, if that's going to win somebody favor, So for those who don't know who Sun Yat-sen is real quick. So Sun Yat-sen saw the modernization of Japan that happened during the Meiji Revolution, and he's like, hey, China can do that too. Why not? So he kind of whipped up enthusiasm for let's become a modern, industrialized, Western-style nation. And he had enough support that stuff started to happen. And maybe I'll do a video on him later on, but, that's just the, Cliff Notes, super sparse edition. Let's see. Alrighty. Sun regained control of Kwantung in early 1923, again with the help of mercenaries from Yunnan and of the Comintern. Undertaking a reform of the KMT, he established a revolutionary government aimed at unifying China under the KMT. That same year, Sun sent Chiang to spend 3 months in Moscow studying the Soviet political and military system. During his trip in Russia, Chiang met Leon Trotsky and other Soviet leaders, but quickly came to the conclusion that the Russian model of government was not suitable for China. Chiang later sent his eldest son, Qing Kuo, to study in Russia. After his father split from the First United Front in 1927, Qing Kuo was forced to stay there as a hostage until 1937. Chiang wrote in his diary, "It is not worth it to sacrifice the interest of the country for the sake of my son." Chiang even refused to negotiate a prisoner swap for his son in exchange for the Chinese Communist Party leader. His attitude remained consistent, and he continued to maintain, by 1937, that I would rather have no offspring than sacrifice our nation's interests. Chiang had absolutely no intention of ceasing the war against the communists. Chiang Kai Shek returned to Kwantung in 1924, and in 1924 Sun appointed him commandant of the Whampoa Military Academy. Chiang resigned from the office after 1 month in a disagreement with Sun's extremely close cooperation with the Comintern, but returned at Sun's demand. The early years at Whampoa allowed Chiang to cultivate a cadre of young officers loyal both to the KMT and to himself. Throughout his rise to power, Chiang also benefited from membership within the nationalist Tan Di Hui fraternity, to which Sun Yat-sen also belonged, and which remained a source of support during his leadership of the Kuomintang. So I guess for Chiang, his time at the Whampoa Military Academy, he was sort of the, oh, captain, my captain figure to several people. I mean, you have that much drive and enthusiasm, you've got to attract attention and probably followers. I mean, how else do you lead a country? Let's see, competition with Wang Jing Wei. I guess this is where it gets a little bit Game of Thrones-ish. I mean, it has been that up until this point, but, Let's see. Sun Yatsin died on March 12, 1925, creating a power vacuum in the Kuomintang. A contest ensued among Wang Jing Wei, yuanjikai, and Hu Hanmin. In August, Lao was assassinated and Hu arrested for his connections to the murderers. Wang Jing Wei, who had succeeded Sun as chairman of the Kwantung regime, seemed ascendant but was forced into exile by Chiang following the Canton coup. The SS Yongfeng, renamed Zhongshan in Sun's honor, had appeared off Changzhou, the location of the Whampoa Academy, on apparently falsified orders, and amid a series of unusual phone calls trying to ascertain Chiang's location. He initially considered fleeing Kwantung and even booked passage on a Japanese steamer, but then decided to use his military connections to declare martial law on March 20th, 1926, and crack down on communist and Soviet influence over the NRA, the military academy, and the party. The right wing of the party supported him and Stalin. Well, that's interesting. Anxious to maintain Soviet influence in the area, had his lieutenants agree to Chiang's demands regarding a reduced communist presence in the KMT leadership in exchange for certain other concessions. The rapid replacement of the army's own regional composition and divided loyalty. Hold on, I skipped something. Let's see. The right wing of the party supported him and Stalin. That's interesting, given that, later on in the 60s and so forth, Chiang was viewed as such an anti-communist figure. But I guess this was early on enough in the Soviet Union that people didn't know what was going on, so they just saw, okay, this guy's going to help us out. Let's see. The right wing of the party supported him and Stalin, anxious to maintain Soviet influence in the area. Had his lieutenants agree to Chiang's demands regarding a reduced communist presence in the KMT leadership in exchange for certain other concessions. The rapid replacement of leadership enabled Chiang to effectively end civilian oversight of the military after May 15th, though his authority was somewhat limited by the army's own regional composition and divided loyalties. So I guess he didn't have all of his people in all the positions he needed. Let's see. On June 5th, 1926, he was named Commander-in-Chief of the National Revolutionary Army, and on July 27th, he finally launched Sun's long-delayed northern expedition aimed at conquering the northern warlords and bringing China together under the KMT. So, for those who don't know what the northern expedition is, so that guy yuanjikai we mentioned earlier. So one of the things he did was, across China, he established these guys to kind of run his business, like the warlords. And then when he dies, they just kind of created their own little fiefdoms and jockeyed for power, and they're all kind of looking out for their own interests. I mean, not to say that Chiang or anybody else wasn't, but it was one of those things where it's like, he knew how to be a better chess player in the theater of war. So let's move on. Let's see. The National Revolutionary Army, the NRA, branched into 3 divisions. To the west was the returned Wang Jing Wei, who led a column to take Wuhan. Bai Chengji's column went east to take Shanghai. Chiang himself led in the middle route, planning to take Nanjing before pressing ahead to capture Beijing. However, in January 1927, Wang Jing Wei and his KMT leftist allies took the city of Wuhan, Wuhan, amid much popular mobilization and fanfare. Allied with a number of Chinese communists and advised by Soviet agent Mikhail Borodin, Wang declared the national government as having moved to Wuhan. Having taken Nanjing in March and briefly visited Shanghai, now under the control of his close ally, Bai Chengji, Chiang halted his campaign and prepared a violent break with Wang's leftist elements, which he believed threatened his control of the KMT. So Wang Jing Wei is an interesting figure. His career pretty much got ruined later on, and you'll find out why. Mikhail Borden. From what I remember in the Jonathan Finby book, he was a dude who loved to... He was ideal for these little sort of military attaché projects where he would go somewhere he was totally out of his element, and he adapted, and he kind of loved that. Let's see. Now with an established national government in Nanjing and supported by conservative allies including Hu Hanmin, Chiang's expulsion of the communists and their Soviet advisors led to the beginnings of the Chinese Civil War. Wang Jing Wei's national government was weak militarily and was soon ended by Chiang with the support of a local warlord, Li Zhongren of Guangxi. Eventually, Wang and his leftist party surrendered to Chiang and joined him in Nanjing in the... I read too quick. In the Central Plains War, Beijing was taken on June 1928. From an alliance of the warlords Feng Yuxiang and Yan Xishan, in December, the Manchurian warlord Zhang Zuelang pledged allegiance to Chiang's government, completing Chiang's nominal unification of China and ending the warlord era. Let's see. In 1927, when he was setting up the nationalist government in Nanjing, he was preoccupied with the Where did I learn to talk? He was preoccupied with the elevation of our leader, Dr. Sun Yatsin, to the rank of Father of our Chinese Republic. Dr. Sun worked for 40 years to lead our people in the nationalist cause, and we cannot allow any other personality to usurp this honored position. He asked Qin Guofu to purchase a photograph that had been taken in Japan around 1885 or 1898. It showed members of the revived China Society with Yuan Kaiwan as president in the place of honor and Sun as secretary on the back row, along with members of the Japanese chapter of the revived China Society. When told that it was not for sale, Chiang offered $1 million to recover the photo and its negative. The party must have this picture and the negative at any price. They must be destroyed as soon as possible. It would be embarrassing to have our father of the Chinese Republic shown in a subordinate position. Chiang never obtained either the photo or its negative. I guess there are some things money just can't buy. Chiang made great efforts to gain recognition as the official successor of Sun Yat-sen. In a pairing of great political significance, Chiang was Sun's brother-in-law. He had married Sun Mei Lang, the younger sister of Sun Qingling, Sun's widow, on December 1st, 1927. Originally rebuffed in the early 1920s, Chiang managed to ingratiate himself to some degree with Sun Mei Ling's mother by first divorcing his wife and concubines and promising to sincerely study the precepts of Christianity. He read the copy of the Bible that Mei Ling had given him twice before making up his mind to become a Christian, and 3 years after his marriage he was baptized in the Sun's Methodist Church. Although some observers felt that he adopted Christianity as a political move, studies of his recently opened diary suggest that his faith was strong and sincere, and that he felt that Christianity reinforced Confucian moral teachings. Upon reaching Beijing, Chiang paid homage to Sun Yat-sen and had his body moved to the new capital of Nanjing to be enshrined in a mausoleum, the Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum. So, in regards to his love life, Chiang's was a wild ride. When he was like 11 or something ridiculous, his mom forced him to marry this older woman. And by older, I mean like 7 years. So like he was like 11 and she was like 18 or something. And this was a thing they did back then, so that a family could be started, and you know, the woman being older would kind of run things and like try to grow him up. And he refused defiantly, and the only reason he went along with the marriage was because his mom threatened to kill herself. And as far as threats go, that'll do it. And he had so many like trysts and affairs. Let's see, he actually, I'm kind of surprised that it doesn't mention it here, but he did marry another woman. This is the person he met before he married Sun Mei-ling. And the thing was, from what we were told, he was really in love with her, and so much so that he said, hey, I'm only marrying Sun Mei-ling so I can advance, the revolutionary cause. But this didn't happen. They were divorced from that time on, and he made a lot of efforts to try to silence her. But this didn't happen. She wrote down everything in a diary that was published, I think, some 50 years later. Anyway, back on to Chiang. Rising power. In the West and in the Soviet Union, Chiang Kai Shek was known as the Red General. Movie theaters in the Soviet Union showed newsreels and clips of Chiang. At Moscow, Sun Yatsin University portraits of Chiang were hung on the walls. And in the Soviet May Day parades that year, Chiang's portrait was to be carried along with the portraits of Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, and other communist leaders. The United States consulate and other Westerners in Shanghai were concerned about the approach of Red General Chiang as his army was seizing control of large areas of the country in the Northern Expedition. So it's an interesting relationship that Chiang had with Western countries. Because right here, they're kind of terrified of him. But later on, in the McCarthy era and up until the 70s, he was this hero trying to retake China from the communists. But in this moment, he's kind of viewed as the threat. It's a really interesting contrast. Excuse me. So, rule. Take two. Having gained control of China, Chiang's party remained surrounded by surrendered warlords who remained relatively autonomous within their own regions. On October 10, 1928, Chiang was named director of the State Council, the equivalent to president of the country, in addition to his other titles. As with his predecessor Sun Yatsin, the Western media dubbed him Generalissimo. I guess it all comes down to coming up with a catchy name. Let's see. According to Sun Yat-sen's plans, the Kuomintang was to rebuild China in 3 steps: military rule, political tutelage, and constitutional rule. The ultimate goal of the KMT revolution was democracy, which was not considered to be feasible in China's fragmented state. Since the KMT had completed the first step of revolution through seizure of power in 1928, Chiang's rule thus began a period of what his party considered to be political tutelage in Sun Yat-sen's name. During this so-called Republican era, many features of a modern, functional Chinese state emerged and developed. So basically, Chiang was an authoritarian, and I don't know that it was ever his idea to implement democracy, but at the same time, he did set up things that would cause China to modernize. It is one of those ultimate political what-ifs of, what if the nationalists had retained control of the mainland and it was the communists who fled to Taiwan? From 1928 to 1937, a time period known as the Nanjing Decade, some aspects of foreign imperialism, concessions, and privileges in China were moderated through diplomacy. The government acted to modernize the legal and penal systems, attempted to stabilize prices, amortize debts, reform the banking and currency systems, build railroads and highways, improve public health facilities, legislate against traffics in narcotics, and augment industrial and agricultural production. Not all of these projects were successfully completed. Efforts were made towards improving education standards, and in an effort to unify Chinese society, the New Life movement was launched to encourage Confucian moral values and personal discipline. Guoyu, national language, was promoted as the standard tongue, and the establishment of communication facilities, including radio, were used to encourage a sense of Chinese nationalism in a way that was not possible when the nation lacked an effective central government. Let's see. Any success that the nationalists did make, however, were met with constant political and military upheavals. While much of the urban areas were now under the control of the KMT, much of the countryside remained under the influence of weakened yet undefeated warlords and communists. Chiang often resolved issues of warlord obstinacy through military action, but such action was costly in terms of men and material. Probably going to need to get some water soon. It's a plan for a future video. Let's see. The 1930 Central Plains War alone nearly bankrupted the nationalist government and caused almost 250,000 casualties on both sides. In 1931, Hu Hanmin, Chiang's old supporter, publicly voiced a popular concern that Chiang's position as both premier and president flew in the face of the democratic ideals of the nationalist government. Chiang had Hu put under house arrest, but he was released after national condemnation, after which he left Nanjing and supported a rival government in Canton. The split resulted in a military conflict between Hu's Kwantung government and Chiang's national government. Chiang only won the campaign against Hu after a shift in allegiance by Zhang Zhuelang, who had previously supported Hu Hanmin. Throughout his rule, complete eradication of the communists remained Chiang's dream. After assembling his forces in Jiangxi, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take a break and get some water. I might play some silly music during an interim. Okay, note for people wanting to do these long videos that are basically just you reading stuff, make sure you get some water, because, yeah. Okay. So, alright, shoot, where was that? Okay. Throughout his rule, complete eradication of the communists remained Chiang's dream. After assembling his forces in Jiangxi, Chiang led his armies against the newly established Chinese Soviet Republic. With help from foreign military advisors, Chiang's fifth campaign finally surrounded the Chinese Red Army in 1934. The communists, tipped off that a nationalist offensive was imminent, retreated in the Long March, during which Mao Zedong rose from a mere military official to the most influential leader of the Chinese Communist Party. on, historical what ifs, you've got to wonder what the long-reaching implications would be if there hadn't been that tip-off. Like, how would our world look like today? Anyway, Chiang, as a nationalist and a Confucianist, was against the iconoclasm of the May 4th movement. Motivated by his sense of nationalism, he viewed some Western ideas as foreign, and he believed that the great introduction of Western ideals in literature that the May 4th movement promoted was not beneficial to China. He and Dr. Sun criticized the May 4th intellectuals as corrupting the morals of China's youth. Contrary to communist propaganda that he was pro-capitalism, Chiang antagonized the capitalists of Shanghai, often attacking them and confiscating their capital and assets for the use of the government. Chiang confiscated the wealth of capitalists even while he denounced and fought against communists. Chiang crushed pro-communist worker and peasant organizations and rich Shanghai capitalists at the same time. Chiang continued the anti-capitalist ideology of Sun Yatsin, directing Kuomintang media to openly attack capitalists and capitalism, while demanding government-controlled industry instead. Chiang has often been interpreted as being pro-capitalism, but this conclusion may be problematic. Shanghai capitalists did briefly support him out of fear of communism in 1927, but this support eroded in 1928 when Chiang turned his tactics of intimidation on them. The relationship between Chiang Kai Shek and Chinese capitalists remained poor throughout the period of his administration. Chiang blocked Chinese capitalists from gaining any political power or voice within his regime. This sounds familiar. Once Chiang Kai Shek was done with his white terror on pro-communist laborers, he proceeded to turn on the capitalists. Gangster connections allowed Chiang to attack them in the international settlement, successfully forcing capitalists to back him up with their assets for his military expeditions. Chiang viewed all the foreign great powers with suspicion, writing in a letter that they all have it in their minds to promote the interests of their own respective countries at the cost of other nations, and seeing it as hypocritical for any of them to condemn each other's foreign policy. He utilized diplomatic persuasion on the United States, Germany, and the Soviet Union to regain lost Chinese territories, as he viewed all foreign powers as imperialists who were attempting to curtail and suppress China's power and national resurrection. Mass death under nationalist rule. Geez, it's this thing where it's such a long, straight read that it's like, I don't know, my mouth is losing its ability to form words properly. Hope somebody gets a laugh out of that. Some sources attribute Chiang Kai Shek with responsibility for millions of deaths in scattered mass death events caused by the nationalist government of China. He has been deemed partially responsible for the man-made 1938 Yellow River flood, which killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians in order to fend off a Japanese advance. This accusation is usually sourced from Rudolf Rummel, who is referring to the nationalist regime as whole rather than Chiang Kai Shek in particular. Regardless, the nationalist government of China has been accused by Rummel of mass killings. He alleged that, based on various claims, the nationalist government of China was responsible for between 6 and 18.5 million deaths. He attributes this death toll to a few major causes. For example, thousands of communist and communist sympathizers killed in the year after the Shanghai massacre. 1.75 to 2.5 million Hainan civilians starved to death due to grain being confiscated and sold to other peasants for the profit of nationalist government officials. 4,212,000, mostly ethnic minority Chinese, perishing at the start of both the Civil War and the Second Sino-Japanese War, starving to death or dying from disease during conscription campaigns. 440,000 to 500,000 Chinese civilians perishing from malnutrition, famine, or nationalist-caused flooding to stop Japanese advance. Geez Louise, we are an hour into this video, and it's like I've only gotten halfway, man, not even halfway, like a quarter of the way into this article. Well, let's see how far we can get along. It's going to be a long ride. All right, let's see. First phase of the Chinese Civil War. In Nanjing on April 1931, Chiang Kai Shek attended a national leadership conference with Zhang Juelang and the general Ma Fuzhang, in which Chiang and Zhang dauntlessly upheld that Manchuria was part of China in the face of the Japanese invasion. After the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Chiang resigned as chairman of the national government. He returned shortly afterwards, adopting the slogan, "First internal pacification, then external resistance." However, this policy of avoiding a frontal war against the Japanese was widely unpopular. In 1932, while Chiang was seeking first to defeat the communists, Japan launched an advance on Shanghai and bombarded Nanjing. This disrupted Chiang's offensive against the communists for a time. Although it was the northern factions of Hu Hanmin's Kwantung government, notably the 19th Rout Army, that primarily led the offensive against the Japanese during this skirmish. Brought into the Nationalist Army immediately after the battle, the 19th Rout Army's career under Chiang would be cut short after it was disbanded for demonstrating socialist tendencies. In 1936, Chiang flew to Xi'an to coordinate a major assault on the Red Army and the Communist Republic that had retreated into Yan'an. However, Chiang's allied commander, Zhang Juelang, whose forces were used in his attack and whose homeland of Manchuria had been recently invaded by the Japanese, did not support the attack on the Communists. On December 12th, Zhang and several other nationalist generals, headed by Yang Hucheng of Jiangxi, kidnapped Chiang for 2 weeks in what is known as the Xi'an Incident. They forced Chiang into making a second united front with the Communists against Japan. After releasing Chiang and returning to Nanjing with him, Zhang was placed under house arrest, and the generals who had assisted him were executed. Chiang's commitment to the Second United Front was nominal at best, and it was all but broken up in 1941. Let's see. So, the Xi'an Incident. So what's really interesting about this was, if you view it purely from a logistical standpoint, going back to Jonathan Finby's novel, this was really fascinating, because when they were thinking about how to do this, they were like, are we going to go in there full regalia, guns a-blazing, and is that how we're going to get them? But they decided on something else. They decided to go in with a small group of people and grab him that way. And ultimately, that's what proved useful. They chose the tactic of, let's not draw a lot of attention to ourselves. It was one of those, like, sort of Ocean's 11 moments where, I can just hear George Clooney planning and laying out the details, saying, like, all right, here's what we're going to do. But yeah, so Second Sino-Japanese War. The Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in July 1937, and in August of that year, Chiang sent 600,000 of his best trained and equipped soldiers to defend Shanghai. With over 200,000 Chinese casualties, Chiang lost the political cream of his Wampo-trained officers. Although Chiang lost militarily, the battle dispelled Japanese claims that it would conquer China in 3 months and demonstrated to the Western powers that the Chinese would continue the fight. By December, the capital of Nanjing had fallen to the Japanese, resulting in the Nanking Massacre. Chiang moved the government inland, first to Wuhan and later to Chongqing. You've got to wonder if, had Chiang not sent those 600,000 of the best trained and equipped from Wampo to this incident, if those people had survived, would he have been able to hold the mainland? I think throughout this video you're going to hear me say that a lot. Like, what if this or what if that? There are so many factors in this patchwork quilt that is this historical episode. Let's see. Having lost most of China's economic and industrial centers, Chiang withdrew into the hinterlands. Somebody tell me what hinterlands means. I like to think I have a good vocabulary, but, you know. Stretching the Japanese supply lines and bogging down Japanese soldiers in the vast Chinese interior. Oh, I should read that again. Having lost most of China's economic and industrial centers, Chiang withdrew into the hinterlands, stretching the Japanese supply lines and bogging down Japanese soldiers in the vast Chinese interior. As part of a policy of protracted resistance, Chiang authorized the use of scorched earth tactics, resulting in many civilian deaths. During the nationalist retreat from Jingzhou, the dams around the city were deliberately destroyed by the nationalist army in order to delay the Japanese advance, killing 500,000 people in the subsequent 1938 Yellow River flood. So this plan seemed that, again, it was a logistic thing. The plan was make it as difficult as possible for Japan to get into like the real interior of China. I think, I forget where it was said or who said it, but there was a similar thing that happened in, I think, the contingency plans for if Japan invaded America. Supposedly, it was said, even if Japan were to invade all across America and get to the capital, even that, even then, you know, they couldn't have won that way. Next time I do one of these videos, I am having some water on the outside. Just that first hour has done more against me than for me. I feel so dry. Let's see. After heavy fighting, the Japanese occupied Wuhan in the fall of 1938, and the nationalists retreated farther inland to Chongqing. While en route to Chongqing, the nationalist army intentionally started the Fire of Changsha as a part of the scorched earth policy. The fire destroyed much of the city, killed 20,000 civilians, and left hundreds of thousands of people homeless. Due to an organizational error, it was claimed, the fire was begun without any warning to the residents of the city. The nationalists eventually blamed 3 local commanders for the fire and executed them. Newspapers across China blamed the fire on non-KMT arsonists, but the blaze contributed to the nationwide loss of support for the KMT. In 1939, Muslim leaders Isa Yusuf Alptekin and Ma Fulang were sent by Chiang to several Middle Eastern countries, including Egypt, Turkey, and Syria, to gain support for the Chinese war against Japan and to express his support for Muslims. The Japanese, controlling the puppet state of Manchukuo and much of China's eastern seaboard, appointed Wang Jing Wei as Quisling ruler of the occupied Chinese territories around Nanjing. Wang named himself president of the executive yuan and chairman of the national government, not the same national government as Chiang's, and led a surprisingly large minority of anti-Chiang, anti-communist Chinese against his old comrades. He died in 1944, within a year of the end of World War II. So I said earlier that Wang Jing Wei his career was just going to go downhill. And this is that point. Some people have called him the Benedict Arnold of China because he basically sided with Japan invading, and pretty much everybody hated him. If his goal was to unite take two. If his goal was to unite China, well, he kind of did it, but you know. All right, the Hui Muslim Ji Dao Tang. The Hui Muslim Jiao. Take three. The Hui Muslim Ji Dao Tang sect pledged allegiance to the Kuomintang after their rise to power, and Hui Muslim general Bai Chongji acquainted Chiang Kai Shek with the Ji Dao Tang Zhao Zhu Ma Mingren in 1941 in Chongqing. In 1942, Generalissimo Chiang Kai Shek went on tour in northwestern China in Xinjiang, Gansu, Ningxia, Shaanxi, and Qinghai, where he met both Muslim generals Ma Buqing and Ma Bufang. He also met the Muslim generals Ma Hongbin and Ma Honghui separately. A border crisis erupted with Tibet in 1942. Under orders from Chiang, Ma Bufang repaired Yushu Airport to prevent Tibetan separatists from seeking independence. Chiang also ordered Ma Bufang to put his Muslim soldiers on alert for an invasion of Tibet in 1942. Ma Bufang complied and moved several thousand troops to the border with Tibet. Chiang also threatened the Tibetans with aerial bombardment if they worked with the Japanese. Ma Bufang attacked the Tibetan Buddhist Sang Monastery in 1941. He also constantly attacked the Labrang Monastery. With the attack on Pearl Harbor and the opening of the Pacific War, China became one of the Allied powers. During and after World War II, Chiang and his American-educated wife, Sung Mei-ling, known in the United States as Madame Chiang, held the support of the China lobby in the United States, which saw in them the hope of a Christian and democratic China. Chiang was even named the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the China War Zone. He was appointed Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath in 1942. General Joseph Stilwell, an American military advisor to Chiang during World War II, strongly criticized Chiang and his generals for what he saw as their incompetence and corruption. In 1944, the United States Army Corps commenced Operation Matterhorn in order to bomb Japan's steel industry from bases to be constructed in mainland China. This was meant to fulfill President Roosevelt's promise to Chiang Kai Shek to begin bombing operations against Japan by November 1944. However, Chiang Kai Shek's subordinates refused to take airbase construction seriously until enough capital had been delivered to permit embezzlement on a massive scale. Stilwell estimated that at least half of the $100 million spent on construction of air bases was embezzled by Nationalist Party officials. Chiang played the Soviets and Americans against each other during the war. He first told the Americans that they would be welcome in talks between the Soviet Union and China, then secretly told the Soviets that the Americans were unimportant and that their opinions would not be considered. Chiang also used American support and military power in China against the ambitions of the Soviet Union to dominate the talks, stopping the Soviets from taking full advantage of the situation in China with the threat of American military action against the Soviets. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, through General Stilwell, privately made it clear that they preferred that the French not reacquire French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. After the war was over, Roosevelt offered Chiang control of all of Indochina. It was said that Chiang replied, under no circumstances. I gotta say, I'm kind of curious. You know, Chiang obviously loved power and he loved control. So it makes you wonder, like, why did he spurn this refusal? it could be, and I'm just guessing, that these were other countries that had, maybe Chiang just had the good sense to know, okay, this is just one, we're already in a war. It started off as civil, now it's a foreign player has been brought in, and after this it's going to become civil again, and it's like, this is just one more thing we have to think about. That's just the first thing I can think of off the top of my head. After the war, 200,000 Chinese troops under General Liu Han were sent by Chiang Kai Shek to northern Indochina, north of the 16th parallel, to accept the surrender of Japanese occupying forces there, and remained in Indochina until 1946, when the French returned. The Chinese used the VNQDD, the Vietnamese branch of the Chinese Kuomintang, to increase their influence in Indochina and to put pressure on their opponents. Chiang Kai Shek threatened the French with war in response to maneuvering by the French and Ho Chi Minh's forces against each other, forcing them to come to a peace agreement. In February 1946, he also forced the French to surrender all of their concessions in China and to renounce their extraterritorial privileges in exchange for the Chinese withdrawing from northern Indochina and allowing French troops to reoccupy the region. Following France's agreement to these demands, the withdrawal of the Chinese troops began in March 1946. So I guess that's what you would call like 4D chess or something. 3 Ryukyus. During the Cairo conference in 1943. Sorry, guys. During the Cairo conference in 1943, Chiang said that Roosevelt asked him whether China would like to claim the Ryukyu Islands from Japan in addition to retaking Taiwan, the Pescadores, and Manchuria. Chiang claims that he said he was in favor of an international presence on these islands. However, the U.S. became the sole protector of the Ryukyus in 1945 and reverted it to the Japanese in 1972 while securing U.S. military presence there. So that's interesting. Because from what I know, it was in the 1950s that America basically handed Japan control of itself, back to Japan. But they didn't, that could be a video itself. Let's see. Second phase of the Chinese Civil War. Dang, there's a whole article about that. Let's see. In 1945, when Japan surrendered, Chiang's Chongqing government was ill-equipped and ill-prepared to reassert its authority in formerly Japanese-occupied China, and it asked the Japanese to postpone their surrender until Kuomintang authority could arrive to take over. American troops and weapons soon bolstered KMT forces, allowing them to reclaim cities. The countryside, however, remained largely under communist control. For over a year after the Japanese surrender, rumors circulated throughout China that the Japanese had entered into a secret agreement with Chiang, in which the Japanese would assist the nationalists in fighting the communists in exchange for the protection of Japanese persons and property there. Many top nationalist generals, including Chiang, had studied and trained in Japan before the nationalists had returned to the mainland in the 1920s, and maintained close personal friendships with top Japanese officials or officers. The Japanese general in charge of all forces in China, General Yasuji Okamura, had personally trained officers who later became generals in Chiang's staff. Reportedly, General Okamura, before surrendering command of all Japanese military officers in Nanjing, offered Chiang control of all 1.5 million Japanese military and civilian support staff then present in China. Reportedly, Chiang seriously considered accepting this offer, but declined only in the knowledge that the United States would certainly be outraged by the gesture. Even so, armed Japanese troops remained in China well into 1947, with some non-commissioned officers finding their way into the Nationalist Officer Corps. That the Japanese in China came to regard Chiang as a magnanimous figure to whom many Japanese owed their lives and livelihoods was a fact attested by both nationalist and communist forces. Oh, I can't believe I didn't mention this earlier. So, one of the things I didn't touch upon earlier in the video was that Chiang did go to Japan to study in the military academy, but I forget exactly what it was. There was some piece of red tape that there was some criteria that he couldn't quite check off on his list that he had to go back to China for. And one of the things he did was he decided, you know what, I'm going to stick around in Japan and become fluent before I head back. And later on in his military studies, I think when he tried to re-enlist, there was a requirement that people study a course in Japanese. And he said, hey, I'm already fluent. Can I sit this out? And they allowed him to. Westad says the communists won the Civil War because they made fewer military mistakes than Chiang Kai Shek, and because in his search for a powerful centralized government, Chiang antagonized too many interest groups in China. Furthermore, his party was weakened in the war against Japan. Meanwhile, the communists told different groups, such as peasants, exactly what they wanted to hear, and cloaked themselves in the cover of Chinese nationalism. This feels like, for any country, kind of a harrowing message. If people are saying all the things you want to hear, watch out. Following the war, the United States encouraged peace talks between Chiang and communist leader Mao Zedong in Chongqing. Due to concerns about widespread and well-documented corruption in Chiang's government throughout his rule, the U.S. government limited aid to Chiang for much of the period of 1946 to 1948 in the midst of fighting against the People's Liberation Army led by Mao Zedong. Alleged infiltration of the U.S. government by Chinese communist agents may have also played a role in the suspension of American aid. So, little red flag, no pun intended, with just my cursory knowledge of what was going on back then. I've got to question how feasible that was. Like, how many... I don't know. To me, it just doesn't match up. Like, it doesn't feel like that the Chinese Communist Party back then had enough connections, because this wasn't too long after the Long March. So, could they have really infiltrated the American government back then, and to such an extent that they caused that much of a hindrance for Chiang Kai Shek? Again, I haven't seen any data or evidence, but it just seems like a bit of a curveball. I kind of don't buy it. Let's see. Chiang's right-hand man, the secret police chief, Dai Li, was both anti-American and anti-communist. Dai ordered Kuomintang agents to spy on American officers. Earlier, Dai had been involved with the Blue Shirt Society, a fascist-inspired paramilitary group within the Kuomintang, which wanted to expel Western and Japanese imperialists, crush the communists, and eliminate feudalism. Dai Li died in a plane crash which was suspected to be an assassination orchestrated by Chiang. Although Chiang had achieved status abroad as world leader, his government deteriorated as a result of corruption and inflation. In his diary on June 1948, Chiang wrote that the KMT had failed, not because of external enemies, but because of rot from within. The war had severely weakened the nationalists, while the communists were strengthened by their popular land reform policies and by a rural population that supported and trusted them. The nationalists initially had superiority in arms and men, but their lack of popularity, infiltration by communist agents, low morale, and disorganization soon allowed the communists to gain the upper hand in the Civil War. Competition with Li Zongren. A new constitution was promulgated in 1947, and Chiang was elected by the National Assembly as the first-term President of the Republic of China on May the 20th, 1948. This marked the beginning of what was termed the Democratic Constitutional Government period by the KMT, political orthodoxy, but the communists refused to recognize the new constitution and its government as legitimate. Chiang resigned as president on January 21st, 1949, as KMT forces suffered terrible losses and defections to the communists. After Chiang's resignation, the vice president of the ROC, Li Zongren, became China's acting president. Shortly after Chiang's resignation, the communists halted their advances and attempted to negotiate the virtual surrender of the ROC. Li attempted to negotiate milder terms that would have ended the Civil War, but without success. When it became clear that Li was unlikely to accept Mao's terms, the communists issued an ultimatum in April 1949, warning that they would resume their attacks if Li did not agree within 5 days. Li refused. Li's attempts to carry out his policies faced varying degrees of opposition from Chiang's supporters and were generally unsuccessful. Chiang especially antagonized Li by taking possession of and moving to Taiwan US $200 million of gold and US dollars belonging to the central government that Li desperately needed to cover the government's soaring expenses. When the communists captured the nationalist capital of Nanjing in April 1949, Li refused to accompany the central government as it fled to Guangdong, instead expressing his dissatisfaction with Chiang by retiring to Zhuangzi. The former warlord, Yuanjikai, who had fled to Nanjing only 1 month before, quickly insinuated himself with the Li-Chiang rivalry, attempting to have Li and Chiang reconcile their differences in the effort to resist the communists. At Chiang's request, Yan visited Li in order to convince Li not to withdraw from public life. Yan broke down in tears while taking the loss of his home province of Jiangxi to the communists, and warned Li that the nationalist cause was doomed unless Li went to Guangdong. Li agreed to return under the condition that Chiang surrender most of the gold and US dollars in his possession that belonged to the central government, and that Chiang stop overriding Li's authority. After Yang communicated these demands and Chiang agreed to comply with them, Li departed for Guangdong. In Guangdong, Li attempted to create a new government composed of both Chiang supporters and those opposed to Chiang. Li's first choice of premier was Chu Cheng, a veteran member of the Kuomintang who had been virtually driven into exile due to his strong opposition to Chiang. After the legislative yuan rejected Chu, Li was obliged to choose Yan Xizhan instead. By this time, Yan was well known for his adaptability, and Chiang welcomed his appointment. Conflict between Chiang and Li persisted, although he had agreed to do so as a prerequisite of Li's return. Chiang refused to surrender more than a fraction of the wealth that he had sent to Taiwan. Without being backed by gold or foreign currency, the money issued by Li and Yan quickly declined in value until it became virtually worthless. Although he did not hold a formal executive position in the government, Chiang continued to order Although he did not hold a formal executive position in the government, Chiang continued to Chiang continued to issue orders to the army and many officers continued to obey Chiang rather than Li. The inability of Li to coordinate KMT military forces led him to put into effect a plan of defense that he had contemplated in 1948. Instead of attempting to defend all of southern China, Li ordered what remained of the nationalist armies to withdraw to Guangxi and Guangdong, hoping that he could concentrate all available defenses on this smaller and more easily defensible area. The object of Li's strategy was to maintain a foothold on the Chinese mainland in the hope that the United States would eventually be compelled to enter the war in China on the nationalist side. This is another political what if. Or not political what if, historical what if. Let's see. To overcome. So what if, they had maintained the defenses in this area? Maybe that would be a really interesting scenario. You have Chiang Kai Shek in Taiwan. You have this pretty considerable area. I could probably do a whole video on that. Maybe I will someday. Let's see. Final communist advance. Chiang opposed Li's plan of defense because it would have placed most of the troops still loyal to Chiang under the control of Li and Chiang's other opponents in the central government. To overcome Chiang's intransigence, Li began ousting Chiang supporters within the central government. Yan Xishan continued in his attempts to work with both sides, creating the impression among the Li supporters that he was a stooge of Chiang, while those who supported Chiang began to bitterly resent Yan for his willingness to work with Li. Because of the rivalry between Chiang and Li, Chiang refused to allow nationalist troops loyal to him to aid in the defense of Guangxi and Canton, with the result that communist forces occupied Canton in October 1949. After Canton fell to the communists, Chiang relocated the government to Chongqing, while Li effectively surrendered his powers and flew to New York for treatment of his chronic duodenum illness at the hospital of Columbia University. Li visited the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, and denounced Chiang as a dictator and an usurper. Li vowed that he would return to crush Chiang once he returned to China. Li remained in exile and did not return to Taiwan. In the early morning of December 10, 1949, communist troops laid siege to Chengdu, and the last KMT-controlled city in mainland China, where Chiang Kai Shek and his son, Chan Qing-kuo, directed the defense at the Chengdu Military Academy. Flying out of Chengdu Feng Huangshan Airport, Chiang Kai Shek, father and son, were evacuated to Taiwan via Guangdong on an aircraft called Meiling and arrived the same day. Chiang Kai Shek would never return to the mainland. Chiang did not reassume the presidency until March 1, 1950. On January 1952, Chiang commanded the Control Yuan, now in Taiwan, to impeach Li in the case of Li Zhongren's failure to carry out duties due to illegal conduct. Chiang relieved Li of the position as vice president in the National Assembly in March 1954. Dang. So, the Jonathan Finby novel, it kind of ends on the note of Chiang's expulsion from China, which is a real shame. I mean, you could argue that his time in Taiwan was a whole book unto itself, and I would love to see him cover that material. Chiang moved the government to Taipei, Taiwan, where he resumed his duties as President of the Republic of China on March 1, 1950. Chiang was re-elected by the National Assembly to be the President of the Republic of China on May 20th, 1954, and again in 1960, 1966, and 1972. He continued to claim sovereignty over all of China, including the territories held by his government and the People's Republic, as well as territory the latter ceded to foreign governments, such as Tuva and Outer Mongolia. In the context of the Cold War, most of the Western world recognized this position, and the ROC represented China in the United Nations and other international organizations until the 1970s. During his presidency on Taiwan, Chiang continued making preparations in order to take back mainland China. He developed the ROC Army in order to prepare for an invasion of the mainland and to defend Taiwan in case of an attack by the communist forces. He also financed armed groups in mainland China, such as Muslim soldiers of the ROC Army left in Yunnan under Li Mi, who continued to fight. It was not until the 1980s that these troops were finally airlifted to Taiwan. He promoted the Uyghur Yulbars Khan to governor during the Islamic insurgency on the mainland for resisting the communists, even though the government had already evacuated to Taiwan. He planned an invasion of the mainland in 1962. In the 1950s, Chiang's airplanes dropped supplies to Kuomintang Muslim insurgents in Amdo. So one of the things I've heard is the reason that the U.S. government never really supported an invasion and a retaking was because, they didn't want to piss off Russia or the Soviet Union. And yeah, would have been interesting to see what would the Soviet Union have done? Certainly they wouldn't have wanted a pro-American government on their doorstep. Let's see. Despite the democratic constitution, the government under Chiang was a one-party state, consisting almost completely of mainlanders. The temporary provisions effective during the period of communist rebellion greatly enhanced executive powers, and the goal of retaking mainland China allowed the KMT to maintain a monopoly on power and the prohibition of opposition parties. The government's official line for these martial law provisions stemmed from the claim that the emergency provisions were necessary, since the communists and the KMT were still in a state of war. Seeking to promote Chinese nationalism, Chiang's government actively ignored and suppressed local cultural expression, even forbidding the use of local languages in mass media broadcasts or during class sessions. As a result of Taiwan's anti-government uprising in 1947, known as the February 28 incident, the KMT-led political repression resulted in the death or disappearance of over 30,000 Taiwanese intellectuals, activists, and people suspected of opposition to the KMT. The first decades after the Nationalists moved the seat of government to the province of Taiwan are associated with the organized effort to resist communism known as the White Terror, during which about 140,000 Taiwanese were imprisoned for their real or perceived opposition to the Kuomintang. Most of those prosecuted were labeled by the Kuomintang as bandit spies, meaning spies for the Chinese communists, and punished as such. Under Chiang, the government recognized limited civil liberties, economic freedoms, property rights, personal and intellectual, and other liberties. Despite these restrictions, free debate within the confines of the legislature was permitted, under the pretext that new elections could not be held in communist-occupied constituencies. Under the pretext that new elections could not be held in communist-occupied constituencies. There we go. The National Assembly, Legislative Yuan, and Control Yuan members held their posts indefinitely. The temporary provisions also allowed Chiang to remain as president beyond the 2-year term limit in the Constitution. He was re-elected by the National Assembly as president 4 times, doing so in 1954, 1960, 1966, and 1972. Believing that corruption and a lack of morals were key reasons that the KMT lost mainland China to the communists, Chiang attempted to purge corruption by dismissing members of the KMT accused of graft. Some major figures in the previous mainland Chinese government, such as Chiang's brother-in-law H. Kung and T.V. Sung, exiled themselves to the United States. Although politically authoritarian and to some extent dominated by government-owned industries, Chiang's new Taiwanese state also encouraged economic development, especially in the export sector. A popular sweeping land reform act, as well as American foreign aid during the 1950s, laid the foundation for Taiwan's economic success, becoming one of the 4 Asian tigers. Chiang personally had the power to review the rulings of all military tribunals, which during the martial law period tried civilians as well. In 1950, Lin Pangchun and 2 other men were arrested on charges of financial crimes and sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison. Chiang reviewed the sentences of all 3 and ordered them executed instead. In 1954, Chang Hua Monk, Cao Chi Te, and 2 others were sentenced to 12 years in prison for providing aid to accused communists. Chiang sentenced them to death after reviewing the case. This control over the decision of military tribunals violated the ROC Constitution. After Chiang's death, the next president, his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, and Chiang Ching-kuo's successor, Li Tenghui, a native Taiwanese, would in the 1980s and 1990s increase native Taiwanese representation in the government and loosen the many authoritarian controls of the early era of ROC control in Taiwan. Relationship with Japan. In 1971, the Australian opposition leader Gough Whitlam, who became Prime Minister in 1972 and swiftly relocated the Australian mission from Taipei to Beijing, visited Japan. After meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister Eisaku Sato, Whitlam observed that the reason Japan at the time was hesitant to withdraw recognition from the nationalist government was the presence of a treaty between the Japanese government and that of Chiang Kai Shek. Sato explained that the continued recognition of Japan towards the nationalist government was due largely to the personal relationship that various members of the Japanese government felt towards Chiang. This relationship was rooted largely in the generous and lenient treatment of Japanese prisoners of war by the nationalist government in the years immediately following the Japanese surrender in 1945, and it was felt especially strongly as a bond of personal obligation by the most senior members then in power. Although Japan recognized the People's Republic in 1972, shortly after Kakue Tanaka seated Sato as Prime Minister of Japan, the memory of this relationship was strong enough to be reported by the New York Times, April 15, 1978, as a significant factor inhibiting the trade between Japan and the mainland. There is no speculation that a clash between communist forces and a Japanese warship in 1978 was caused by Chinese anger after Prime Minister Takeo Fukuda attended Chiang's funeral. Historically, Japanese attempts to normalize their relationship with the People's Republic were met with accusations of ingratitude in Taiwan. Chiang was suspicious. Relationship with the United States. Chiang was suspicious that covert operatives of the United States plotted a coup against him. In 1950, Chiang Ching-kuo became director of the Secret Police, Bureau of Investigation and Statistics, which he remained until 1965. Chiang was also suspicious of politicians who were overtly friendly to the United States and considered them his enemies. In 1953, 7 days after surviving an assassination attempt, Wu Kuo-chen lost his position as governor of Taiwan province to Chiang Ching-kuo. After fleeing to the United States the same year, he became a vocal critic of Chiang's family and government. Chiang Ching-kuo, educated in the Soviet Union, initiated Soviet-style military organization in the Republic of China military. He reorganized and Sovietized the political officer corps and propagated Kuomintang ideology throughout the military. Sun Yatsin, who was educated at the American Virginia Military Institute, was opposed to this. Chiang Ching-kuo orchestrated the controversial court-martial and arrest of General Sun Yatsin in August 1955 for plotting a coup d'etat with the American CIA against his father Chiang Kai Shek in the Kuomintang. The CIA allegedly wanted to help Sun take control of Taiwan and declare its independence. Let's see, death. In 1975, 26 years after Chiang came to Taiwan, he died in Taipei at the age of 87. He had suffered a heart attack and pneumonia in the foregoing months and died from renal failure aggravated with advanced cardiac arrest on April 5th. Chiang's funeral was held on April 16th. A month of mourning was declared. Chinese music composer Huang Yaotai wrote the Chiang Kai Shek memorial song. In mainland China, however, Chiang's death was met with little apparent mourning, and communist state-run newspapers gave the brief headline, "Chiang Kai Shek has died." Chiang's body was put in a copper coffin and temporarily interred at his favorite residence in Sihu Dashi Taoyuan. His funeral was attended by dignitaries from many nations, including American Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, South Korean Prime Minister Kim Jong-pil, and two former Japanese Prime Ministers, Nobusuke Kishi and Eisako Sato. Chiang Kai Shek Memorial Day was established on April 5th. The Memorial Day was disestablished in 2007. When his son Chiang Ching-kuo died in 1988, he was entombed in a separate mausoleum in nearby Taoliao. The hope was to have both buried at their birthplace in Finghua if and when it was possible. In 2004, Chang Fangliang, the widow of Chiang Ching-kuo, asked that both father and son be buried at Wuji Mountain Military Cemetery in Jishi, Taipei County, now New Taipei City. Chiang's ultimate funeral ceremony became a political battle between the wishes of the state and the wishes of his family. Chiang was succeeded as president by Vice President Yin Chia-kan and as Kuomintang party ruler by his son Chiang Ching-kuo, who retired Chiang Kai-shek's title of Director General and instead assumed the position of chairman. Yin's presidency was interim. Chiang Ching-kuo, who was the premier, became president after Yin's term ended 3 years later. Cult of personality. Chiang's portrait hung over Tiananmen Square before Mao's portrait was set up in its place. People also put portraits of Chiang in their homes and in public on the streets. After his death, the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Song was written in 1988 to commemorate Chiang Kai-shek. In Shihu, there are several statues of Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang was popular among many people and dressed in plain, simple clothes, unlike contemporary Chinese warlords who dressed extravagantly. Quotes from the Quran and Hadith were used by Muslims in the Kuomintang-controlled Muslim publication, the Yuure, to justify Chiang Kai-shek's rule over China. When the Muslim general and warlord Ma Lin was interviewed, Ma Lin was described as having high admiration for and unwavering loyalty to Chiang Kai-shek. In the Philippines, a school was named in his honor in 1939. Today, Chiang Kai-shek is the largest educational institute for the Chinoy community in the country. Philosophy. The Kuomintang used traditional Chinese religious ceremonies and promulgated/practiced martyrdom in Chinese culture. Kuomintang ideology subserved and promulgated the view that the souls of party martyrs who died fighting for the Kuomintang, the revolution, and the party founder Dr. Sun Yatsin were sent to heaven. Chiang Kai-shek believed that these martyrs witnessed events on earth from heaven after their deaths. When the northern expedition was complete, Kuomintang generals led by Chiang Kai-shek paid tribute to Dr. Sun's soul in heaven with a sacrificial ceremony at the Jiangshan Temple in Beijing in July 1928. Among the Kuomintang generals present were the Muslim generals Bai Chongzhi and Ma Fuzhang. Chiang Kai-shek considered both Han Chinese and all ethnic minorities of China, the 5 races under one union, as descendants of the Yellow Emperor, the mythical founder of the Chinese nation, and belonging to the Chinese nation Zhonghua Minzu, and he introduced this into Kuomintang ideology, which was propagated into the educational system of the Republic of China. Contemporary public perception. Chiang's legacy has been the target of heated debates because of the different views held about him. For some, Chiang was a national hero who led the victorious northern expedition against the Beiyang warlords in 1927, achieving Chinese unification, and who subsequently led China to ultimate victory against Japan in 1945. Some blamed him for not doing enough against the Japanese forces in the lead-up to and during the Second Sino-Japanese War, preferring to withhold his armies for the fight against the communists, or merely waiting and hoping that the United States would get involved. Some also see him as champion of anti-communism, being a key figure during the formative years of the World Anti-Communist League. During the Cold War, he was also seen as the leader who led Free China and the bulwark against a possible communist invasion. However, Chiang presided over purges, political authoritarianism, and graft during his tenure in mainland China, and ruled throughout a period of imposed martial law. His governments were accused of being corrupt even before he even took power in 1928. He also allied with known criminals like Du Yuexing for political and financial gains. Some opponents charged that Chiang's efforts in developing Taiwan were mostly to make the island a strong base from which to one day return to mainland China, and that Chiang had little regard for the long-term prosperity and well-being of the Taiwanese people. Today, Chiang's popularity in Taiwan is divided along political lines, enjoying greater support among Kuomintang supporters. He is generally unpopular among Democratic Progressive Party voters and supporters who blame him for the thousands killed during the February 28 incident and criticize his subsequent dictatorial rule. In sharp contrast to his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, and to Sun Yatsin, his memory is rarely invoked by current political parties, including the Kuomintang. In contrast, his image has been rehabilitated in contemporary mainland China. Well, there's an M. Night Shyamalan plot twist. Until recently, portrayed as a villain who fought against the liberation of China by the communists, since the 2000s, he's been portrayed by the media in a neutral or slightly positive light as a Chinese nationalist who tried to bring about national blah. Let me start over. Until recently portrayed as a villain who fought against the liberation of China by the communists, since the 2000s, he's been portrayed by the media in a neutral or slightly positive light as a Chinese nationalist who tried to bring about national unification and resisted the Japanese invasion during World War II. This shift is largely in response to current political landscape of Taiwan, in relation to Chiang's commitment to a unified China and his stance against Taiwanese separatism during his rule of the island, along with the recent détente between the Chinese Communist Party and Chiang's KMT. In contrast to efforts to remove his public monuments in Taiwan, his ancestral home in Finghua, Zhejiang, on the mainland has become a commemorative museum and major tourist attraction. That's interesting. In the United States and Europe, Chiang was often perceived negatively as the one who lost China to the communists. His constant demands for Western support and funding also earned him the nickname of General Cash My Check. In the West, he has been criticized for his poor military skills. He had a record of issuing unrealistic orders and persistently attempting to fight unwinnable battles, leading to the loss of his best troops. In recent years, there has been an attempt to find a more moderate interpretation of Chiang. Chiang is now increasingly perceived as a man simply overwhelmed by the events in China, having to fight simultaneously communists, Japanese, and provincial warlords, while having to reconstruct and unify the country. His sincere, albeit often successful attempts to build a more powerful nation have been noted by scholars such as Jonathan Finby, hey, there's our guy, and Rana Mitter. Mitter has observed that, ironically, today's China is closer to Chiang's vision than to Mao Zedong's. He argues that the communists since the 1980s have essentially created the state envisioned by Chiang in the 1930s. Mitter concludes by writing that one can imagine Chiang Kai Shek's ghost wandering around China today, nodding in approval, while Mao's ghost follows behind him, moaning at the destruction of his vision. Lang Shuming opined that Chiang Kai Shek's greatest contribution was to make the CCP successful. If he had been a bit more trustworthy, if his character was somewhat better, the CCP would have been unable to beat him. Formosa Betrayed, one of the few American movies concerning the process of democratization in Taiwan, depicts Chiang Kai Shek as a brutal dictator responsible for the execution of thousands of native Taiwanese during the days following the February 28 incident. Let's see. Family. In 1901, okay, I thought they were just going to skip over this, but they were saving it for later on. In 1901, in an arranged marriage at age 14, okay, there's a redaction there for me. I said 11 earlier, but it was 14. Still, that's crazy young by today's standards. In 1901, in an arranged marriage at age 14, Chiang was married to a fellow villager named Mao Fumei, who was illiterate and 5 years his senior. While married to Mao, Chiang adopted... Well, that's kind of ironic. Married to Mao. That was also the name of his rival. While married to Mao, Chiang adopted 2 concubines. Concubinage was still a common practice for well-to-do non-Christian males in China. He took Yao Ye-ching as a concubine in late 1912 and married Chen Jieru in December 1921. While he was still living in Shanghai, Chiang and Yao adopted a son, Wei Kuo. Chen adopted a daughter in 1924 named Yao Guang, who later adopted her mother's surname. Chen's autobiography refuted the idea that she was a concubine, Chen claiming that by the time she married Chiang, he had already divorced Yao, and that Chen was therefore his wife. Chiang and Mao had a son, Cheng Kuo. According to the memoirs of Chen Jieru, Chiang's second wife, she contracted gonorrhea from Chiang soon after their marriage. He told her that he acquired this disease after separating from his first wife and living with his concubine, Yao Ye-cheng, as well as with many other women he consorted with. His doctor explained to her that Chiang had sex with her before completing his treatment for the disease. As a result, both Chiang and Chen Cheju believed that they had become sterile, which would explain why he had only one child by his first wife. However, a purported miscarriage by Sung Mei Ling in August 1928 would, if it actually occurred, cast serious doubt on whether this was true. Let's see. Religion and relationships with religious communities. I skipped over this part. I don't know because, well, let me see. You know, I won't skip over it. My bad, everyone. The Jikuo Changs were descendants from Chang Shi-che, who, during the 1600s, moved there from Fenghua district, whose ancestors in turn came to southeastern China's Zhejiang province after moving out of northern China in the 13th century AD. The 12th century BC Duke of Zhao's third son was the ancestor of the Changs. His great-grandfather was Chang Qizhang. His grandfather was Chang Shi-chan. His uncle was Chang Zhaohai, and his father was Chang Zhaokong. And there's this long list. Let's see. Chang personally dealt extensively with religions and power figures in China during his regime. Religious views. Chiang Kai Shek was born and raised as a Buddhist, but became a Methodist upon his marriage to his fourth wife, Sung Mei Ling. It was previously believed that this was a political move, but studies of his recently opened diaries suggested that his faith was sincere. Chiang relationships with Muslims. Chiang developed relationships with other generals. Chiang became a sworn brother of the Chinese Muslim general Ma Fuzhang and appointed him to high-ranking positions. Chiang addressed Ma Fuzhang's son, Ma Honghui as Xiaoyun Shizhong. Ma Fuzhang attended national leadership conferences with Chiang during battles against Japan. Ma Honghui was eventually scapegoated for the failure of the Ningxia campaign against the communists, so he moved to the U.S. instead of remaining in Taiwan with Chiang. When Chiang became president of China after the Northern Expedition, my bad everyone, he carved out Ningxia and Qinghai out of Gansu province and appointed Muslim generals as military governors of all three provinces, Ma Honghui, Ma Hongbin, and Ma Xi. The three Muslim governors, known as Shibe Sanma, literally the three Mas of the Northwest, controlled armies composed entirely of Muslims. Chiang called on the three and their subordinates to wage war against the Soviet peoples, Tibetans, Communists, and the Japanese. Chiang continued to appoint Muslims as governors of the three provinces, including Ma Lin, Ma Fusho. Chiang's appointments, the first time that Muslims had been appointed as governors of Gansu, increased the prestige of Muslim officials in northwestern China. The armies raised by this Ma clique, most notably their Muslim cavalry, were incorporated in the KMT army. Chiang appointed a Muslim general, Bai Zhongqi, as the Minister of National Defense of the Republic of China, which controlled the ROC military. Chiang also supported the General Ma Zhongying, whom he had trained at Wampo Military Academy during the Kumo Rebellion in a jihad against Jin Shuren, Xing Shikai, and the Soviet Union during the Soviet invasion of Xinjiang. Chiang designated Ma's Muslim army as the 36th Division National Revolutionary Army and gave his troops Kuomintang flags and uniforms. Chiang then supported Muslim General Ma Hushan against Xing Shikai and the Soviet Union in the Xinjiang War, 1937. All Muslim generals commissioned by Chiang in the National Revolutionary Army swore allegiance to him. Several, like Ma Xiaowu and Ma Hushan, were loyal to Chiang and Kuomintang hardliners. The Li Rebellion and Pei Tashan incident plagued relations with the Soviet Union during Chiang's rule and caused trouble with the Uyghurs. During the Li Rebellion and Pei Tashan incident, Chiang deployed Hui troops against Uyghur mobs in Turfan and against Soviet, Russian, and Mongols at Petashan. During Chiang's rule, attacks on foreigners by Kuomintang forces flared up in several incidents. One of these was the Battle of Kashgar, where a Muslim army loyal to the Kuomintang massacred 4,500 Uyghurs and killed several Britons at the British consulate in Kashgar. Hu Songshan, a Muslim imam, backed by Chiang Kai Shek's regime and gave prayers for his government. ROC flags were saluted by Muslims in Ningxia during prayer, along with exhortations to nationalism during Chiang's rule. Chiang sent Muslim students abroad to study at places like Al-Azhar University, and Muslim schools throughout China taught loyalty to his regime. The Yuehua, a Chinese Muslim publication, quoted the Quran and Hadith to justify submitting to Chiang Kai Shek as the leader of China and as justification for jihad in the war against Japan. The Yihewani, aka Muslim Brotherhood, was the predominant Muslim sect backed by the Chiang government during Chiang's regime. Other Muslim sects like the Ji Tao Tang and Sufi brotherhoods like Jawariya and Kufiya were also supported by his regime. The Chinese Muslim Association, a pro-Kuomintang and anti-communist organization, was set up by Muslims working in his regime. Salafism attempted to gain a foothold in China during his regime, but the Yihewani and Hanafi Sunni Gedimu denounced the Salafis as radicals, engaged in fights against them, and declared them heretics, forcing the Salafis to form a separate sect. Ma Qingchang, a Muslim general, served as an advisor to Chiang Kai Shek. Ma Buqing was another Muslim general who fled to Taiwan along with Chiang. His government donated money to build the Taipei Grand Mosque in Taiwan. Relationship with Buddhists and Christians. Chiang had uneasy relations with the Tibetans. He fought against them in the Sino-Tibetan War and he supported the Muslim general Ma Bufang in his war against Tibetan rebels in Qinghai. Chiang ordered Ma Bufang to prepare his Islamic army to invade Tibet several times to deter Tibetan independence, and threatened them with aerial bombardment. After the war, Chiang appointed Ma Bufang as his ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Chiang incorporated Methodist values into the New Life movement under the influence of his wife. Dancing and Western music were discouraged. In one incident, several youths splashed acid on people wearing Western clothing, although Chiang was not directly responsible for these incidents. Despite being a Methodist, he made a reference to the Buddha in his diary and encouraged the establishment of a Buddhist political party under Master Tai Zhu. According to the Jehovah's Witnesses, some of their members traveled to Chongqing and spoke to him personally while distributing their literature during the Second World War. And I believe that's it. Wow. So we clocked about 2 hours. I have to say, I thought this video was going to end in like a couple minutes, but this was a project. So I might go about doing this differently. I might record bits and pieces of this at a time next time because this took a while. But I had fun trying this out. Maybe this will be how I do long form content. Maybe not. Oh, excuse me. We'll see, but it's been a blast. Until next time on a Wikipedia Deep Dive, have a good one.